Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into a story you might not know as well, uh, a presidential assassination,
Oh, yeah.
but not the one you're probably thinking of.
Right.
We're going past Lincoln this time to explore the assassination of James Garfield.
Yeah,
It's lesser known for sure,
it is.
but equally fascinating, I think, and we're basing our deep dive today on an episode of the American History Tellers podcast.
Okay.
What really struck me listening to this story is how closely it's tied to the politics of post-Civil War America.
Hmm.
Specifically, the whole debate over the spoils system.
Yeah, the spoils system is really interesting. Basically, the simplest way to put it is that whoever won an election got to hand out all the government jobs to their supporters.
Really?
Yeah, so loyalty was way more important than qualifications.
Oh, wow. So it really was like, to the victor go the spoils,
Yeah,
but like on a national level.
exactly. And you can imagine how corrupt and inefficient that made things.
No wonder people wanted to reform that.
Oh, yeah, big time. And that's where you get these two main factions in the Republican Party at the time, the stalwarts and the reformers.
Okay.
So the stalwarts were all about keeping the spoils system. They saw it as the way to reward loyalty, keep control of the party. The reformers, on the other hand, wanted a merit-based system. They thought competence, not connections, should decide who got government jobs.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So where does James Garfield fit in all of this?
Right. So Garfield's story is really interesting.
Yeah.
He goes from poverty to congressman to Civil War hero, even becoming a major general.
Wow.
Then kind of reluctantly gets nominated for president as this compromise candidate.
Did he side with either the stalwarts or the reformers?
Well, that's the thing about Garfield. He was seen as this guy who could maybe bring the two sides together.
Oh, so kind of a middle ground.
Exactly. He wasn't a diehard stalwart, but he wasn't a radical reformer either. So he was appealing to a party that was really trying to stay unified.
Sounds like they were trying to have their cake and eat it too, hoping he'd lean one way or the other once he got into office.
Yeah. Right. And trying to please everybody like that. Well, it ended up having some pretty tragic consequences.
Like what?
Well, it kind of set the stage for this guy named Charles Guiteau to enter the picture.
Okay, I gotta say, Guiteau is a fascinating character. Eccentric, delusional, failed at pretty much everything he tried.
Yeah.
And like obsessed with politics.
Oh, yeah. Guiteau's a really important part of this whole thing. He thought he was way more important than he actually was and completely believed in the spoils system, thought he was the reason Garfield got elected.
Oh, wow.
And so because of that, he thought he deserved a top diplomatic post as a reward.
So basically, in his mind, he single-handedly got Garfield elected.
Pretty much. He was fixated on getting this prestigious Paris consulship and just kept hounding Garfield and Secretary of State James Blaine about it.
Can you imagine doing that today?
Yeah.
Just showing up at the State Department and demanding a job from the Secretary of State.
It's crazy, right? But back then, people had more access to their elected officials, I guess. Plus, Guiteau just thought he was entitled to it.
That's wild. So what happened when he didn't get the job?
Well, when all his efforts were ignored, things took a pretty dark turn for him.
I bet.
He was obsessed with getting that government job and then started getting resentful of Garfield trying to reform the spoils system. It was not a good combination.
Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
So Garfield's not exactly popular with everyone at this point, right?
Yeah.
Especially within his own party.
Not at all. There's a lot of tension between him and the stalwarts, especially their leader, Roscoe Conkling. Garfield challenges Conkling and ends up winning a big political showdown.
Ooh, I bet that didn't go over well.
Nope. Guiteau sees this as proof that Garfield is the enemy.
Wow, so in his mind, if he gets rid of Garfield, he's helping the stalwarts and clearing the way for Vice President Chester Arthur to become president.
Exactly. Arthur was a well-known stalwart. So it's incredible how one person's crazy ideas can have such a huge impact.
It really is. Guiteau's whole plan was based on delusion, obsession, and this messed up sense of what's right.
Yeah, he really thought he was like an instrument of destiny, some kind of hero acting on behalf of the nation.
It's scary how messed up someone's logic can be.
It really is. And that messed up logic led him to plan Garfield's assassination very carefully.
And he even picked a specific type of revolver because he thought it would end up in a museum, right?
Yeah, it's true. He chose one with an ivory handle because he thought it would become a historical artifact. It's crazy how much he was caught up in his own delusion.
It's hard to even imagine thinking like that. So at this point, presidential security was still pretty much non-existent, right?
Yeah, even after Lincoln's assassination just 16 years before, there were no bodyguards, no real protection for the president.
You're kidding. That seems so irresponsible.
It does now, but back then the idea of guarding a president like that seemed kind of against American ideal.
I guess things were different then. So it's July 1881. Garfield's at a train station going on vacation with his family, and Guiteau's just waiting for him.
It's such a contrast. You have this everyday scene, Garfield's relaxed with his loved ones, and then this danger lurking in the background.
It really shows how quickly things can change.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So what happens next? Well, it's total chaos. Guiteau fires 2 shots. One hits Garfield's arm, the other goes into his back.
Oh my gosh.
Garfield screams in pain and shock, and the whole station panics. As Guiteau is being arrested, he shouts, "I am a stalwart and want Arthur for president."
That's so chilling. It's crazy how he really thought he was doing the right thing.
I know it's a scary reminder that people can get so lost in their own world that they lose all sense of decency and forget about the consequences.
So what happens after they arrest Guiteau?
Well, everything's really chaotic and scary at first. Garfield's injuries aren't immediately fatal, but it's obvious that it's serious. And that's where the story gets even worse because of the medical care he receives.
Yeah, the medical practices back then weren't exactly what we'd call good.
That's putting it mildly. The things they knew and did back then are just shocking compared to what we have now.
I can imagine. And I read that the doctor in charge of Garfield's care, Dr. Willard Bliss, was a pretty stubborn guy with some really outdated ideas.
Yeah, Dr. Bliss was a well-known doctor, but by today's standards, what he did is crazy. He used instruments that weren't sterilized, wouldn't listen to other doctors who disagreed with him, and even fed Garfield rich food that made him sicker.
Wow, you'd think they would know better.
It just goes to show how much medicine has changed and how even smart doctors can be blinded by their own biases and outdated knowledge.
So they even called in Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, to
Yes,
help, right, to find the bullet.
Yeah, Bell had invented this early metal detector and thought it could find the bullet.
Did it work?
Well, Dr. Bliss was so sure the bullet was in a certain place that they didn't use Bell's invention properly.
You're kidding.
Yeah.
They had this amazing new technology, but the doctor's assumptions got in the way.
It's heartbreaking, right? They had the tools, but human error messed everything up.
Yeah.
It just shows how important collaboration, open-mindedness, and being willing to question your assumptions are, especially in medicine.
So Garfield's basically stuck with Dr. Bliss and his old-fashioned treatments. What was it like for him?
It was horrible. He was in constant pain, throwing up all the time, and had a fever for weeks.
That sounds awful.
It was, but he was incredibly strong throughout it all. He tried to stay positive and even joked around with people.
Really? Wow, that's impressive.
I know he had such a strong spirit even though his body was failing him.
So what happens in the end?
Well, the infection got worse and worse because of the bad medical care. And after weeks of suffering, Garfield died on September 19th, 1881.
That's so sad. It's like he was killed twice by the assassin's bullet and by bad medical decisions.
It really is. Garfield's death shocked the whole nation and started a huge conversation about how American medicine needed to change and the dangers of clinging to old ways of doing things.
It's amazing how this one event, this one act of violence, ended up impacting so many different parts of American society.
It's true. History's full of these moments where what seems like an isolated event ends up having these huge ripple effects.
Mm-hmm.
And in Garfield's case, his assassination really pushed people to change things in ways no one could have predicted.
It's incredible. We've gone from a little-known presidential assassination to talking about political corruption, dangerous extremists, and how medicine has changed so much.
And we're just getting started. In part 2, we'll talk about what happened after Garfield's assassination, like the shocking things they found during the autopsy, the public outcry, and some surprising consequences that actually led to the end of the system that Guiteau was trying so hard to protect.
Wow, can't wait to hear it. Stay tuned, everyone, as we keep digging into this fascinating and tragic chapter of American history. So we talked about everything leading up to Garfield's assassination and, the horrible medical care he got. What happened after he died? Did the country just kind of mourn and move on?
Not really. Garfield's death was definitely a tragedy, but it wasn't the end of the story. It actually kind of started a whole new chapter 1 with some shocking stuff coming to light and some consequences no one saw coming.
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of shocking stuff?
Well, first off, what they found during the autopsy was pretty crazy. The bullet wasn't even close to where Dr. Bliss thought it was. It was near his pancreas, not his liver. And the infection was just terrible. It was obvious that the way they treated him medically had made things a lot worse.
Wow, they were way off. It's scary to think that if he had gotten the right care, maybe he could have lived.
Yeah, it's a what if. That's hard to think about. Medical experts now say that the bullet itself probably wouldn't have killed him. It was the infection and the way they treated his wounds that did it.
So what did people think about all this when they found out?
People were furious. Of course they were. Finding out about all the medical mistakes really made people want to change things. Not just in medicine, but in politics, too. They started to see how dangerous it was to have a system where loyalty was more important than being good at your job, especially for important government positions.
So it sounds like Garfield's death really made people see that the spoils system was messed up.
Yeah, exactly. People started asking why we were giving important jobs to people just because they knew the right people. The idea of having a system based on what you knew and how good you were at your job got more and more popular.
Okay, so what about Vice President Chester Arthur? He was a stalwart. The guy Guiteau wanted to be president. Did he try to keep things the way they were?
Well, this is where things get interesting. Even though Arthur had been all about the spoil system before he really changed once he became president.
Oh, really? So he didn't just ignore everything and act like nothing was wrong?
Nope, he didn't. It
Ha-
seems like seeing how awful Garfield's assassination was and maybe thinking about what he believed in made him change his mind.
Wow, so he actually started supporting reform. What a twist. I bet people were surprised.
Arthur had been seen as a symbol of corruption, and suddenly he was this champion for doing things the right way. He used his position to fight for changes in the civil service.
So how did he do that? What did he actually do?
The biggest thing he did was support the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which became law in 1883. This law said that most federal government jobs had to be given to the best person for the job based on exams and stuff. Politicians couldn't just give jobs to their friends anymore.
That's huge. It's like Guiteau tried so hard to protect the spoils system and accidentally caused its downfall. That's some serious irony.
It is. It's like a textbook example of unintended consequences. Guiteau thought he was doing something good for the stalwarts, but he ended up destroying the very thing he was trying to save.
History is full of stuff like that.
Mm.
It makes you realize that even little things can have huge and unpredictable consequences.
It's so true. We tend to think of history as a straight line, but it's way more complicated than that. It's all these events connected to each other, and sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest impact.
Okay, so what happened to Charles Guiteau after the assassination?
His trial was this huge media circus. It was political drama and psychological craziness all rolled into one.
I bet it was the talk of the town.
Oh, yeah, totally. People were obsessed with how erratic he was and how much he believed he was in the right. He even tried to get money from people watching the trial and give legal advice to his own lawyer.
It sounds like he was completely lost in his own world.
Hmm.
Did they ever think about saying he was insane?
They did bring up the insanity defense, but the jury didn't believe it. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. And even as they were taking him to be hanged, he still thought history would prove him right.
Wow, that's intense. He was so convinced he was doing the right thing that he couldn't see how bad his crime was, even when he was about to die. It's scary how powerful self-deception can be.
It shows how dangerous fanaticism is. No matter how misguided, it can make people do awful things and then justify it to themselves.
So you have this guy, Charles Guiteau, who thinks he's better than he is and wants power. He kills the president because he thinks he's saving the country. And in doing so, he actually brings about the very changes he was fighting against. That's crazy.
It is. It shows how fragile leadership can be and how flawed a system is when it cares more about who you know than how good you are at something. And it shows how the things we do can have unintended consequences.
You know, it's amazing how much this deep dive has grown.
Yeah.
We started with this one assassination, and now we're talking about political corruption changes in medicine, how public opinion matters, and even the psychology of extremists.
It is pretty amazing, isn't it? That's what I love about exploring history. You never know where it'll take you. Every event, every person is part of a bigger story, a chain of causes and effects that shapes the world we live in.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. You find all these hidden complexities under the surface. And in this story, we've seen how humans are always struggling for power, justice, and progress.
And it shows that even in the worst times, good things can come out of tragedy.
We've covered so much in this deep dive. The politics of the Gilded Age, the problems with 19th century medicine. It's amazing to see how all these things came together at this important time in American history.
And it shows how one event, like the assassination of a president, can have such a big impact. Not just in the moment, but for a long time afterward. It shapes the country and the world.
You know, it's amazing how this whole thing started with this one act of violence, and it's opened up all these different events and ideas. Makes you wonder how different things might have been if Garfield had gotten better medical care.
It's one of those big what-ifs in history, isn't it? It's definitely possible that if Garfield had lived, he could have been the one to push for change.
Yeah, he already took on the stalwarts and won.
Yeah.
So if he had lived, do you think he would have been even bolder with reforming the civil service? Would we even have the Pendleton Act if he hadn't died?
It's interesting to think about, isn't it? Maybe as president, he could have made things happen in a different way, or maybe people wouldn't have wanted change as much if his death hadn't been so tragic.
Yeah, history is full of these moments where someone does something and it mixes with what's going on in society and creates real change. Makes you think about how even small choices can have a big impact.
For sure. It reminds us that we're all part of something bigger, and the things we do, even the little things, can affect a lot more than just ourselves.
We've talked about the politics and the medical stuff, but what really gets me is the human side of it. A president killed way too young by someone who was delusional and wanted power. It's sad, but also kind of ironic, and there's a little bit of hope in there too.
Yeah, the human stories are what make history so interesting. You see Garfield with all his ambition and hope for the country, then Guiteau with his crazy ideas and need for power, and then Arthur who changes completely. It reminds you that history isn't just dates and facts, it's about real people who lived through those times and shaped the world we live in now.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. We started with this assassination that not a lot of people know about and ended up learning about the Gilded Age 19th century medicine and how human ambition can be both good and bad.
It shows that history is full of surprises and that things are connected in ways you wouldn't expect. There are lessons we can learn from it even today.
And it shows how important it is to be curious and to look at the parts of history that aren't as well known. You never know what you might find or how it might connect to other things.
So, as we wrap up our look at the assassination of James Garfield, I hope you'll keep exploring and asking questions and learning. Dive into the things that interest you. You might be surprised at what you discover and the new ways you start to see the world.
And one last thing to think about. What are some of the things that have happened in your life that seemed small at the time but ended up having a big impact? How did those things change how you see the world?
And don't forget to join us next time for another deep dive into history. We'll be talking about William McKinley's assassination, how Theodore Roosevelt became president, and the start of a new era in American politics. Until then, keep exploring and stay curious.